The gunshot that killed her father still echoed in Emma Catherine's mind 3 days later, as she knelt in the driving snow. Her hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath the layer of frost forming on her skin. She had walked for miles from Taylorsville, Utah, leaving behind the smoking ruins of her family's ranch and the shallow grave she had managed to dig in the frozen earth before her strength gave out. Now, somewhere in the wilderness between civilization and oblivion, she had simply stopped walking, dropped to her knees, and begun to pray. "Please," she whispered into the howling wind, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. "Please let it end. I cannot go on. I have nothing left. Take me now." The snow fell harder, as if God himself was trying to bury her alive, and Emma found herself grateful for it. At 22 years old, she had already lived through more heartbreak than most women endured in a lifetime. Her mother had died giving birth to her younger brother when Emma was 14. That brother, sweet little Thomas, had succumbed to scarlet fever just 2 winters ago. And now her father, the last person on earth who loved her, lay dead because he had refused to sell their land to the railroad men who wanted it. She could still see the lead man's face, cold and calculating beneath his expensive hat, as he had told her father that accidents happened to stubborn people. 2 days later, their barn had caught fire. When her father ran out to save the horses, someone had shot him. Emma had heard the crack of the rifle, had seen him fall, but by the time she reached him, the shooter was gone, vanished into the darkness like a demon returning to hell. The town marshal had shrugged and said there was nothing he could do without witnesses. Emma knew the truth, though. The marshal was in the railroad's pocket, just like half the men in Taylorsville. Her father had told her as much before he died, blood bubbling on his lips as he struggled to speak. He had made her promise to run, to get away before they came back for her, so she had run. But now, kneeling in the snow with the cold seeping into her bones, Emma realized she had nowhere to run to. No family, no home, no future. Death seemed like a mercy, and she prayed for it with all the fervor she had once reserved for prayers of thanksgiving and hope. "For death," she said aloud, her voice stronger now, defiant even. "That is what I pray for, death swift and final, not while I am here to stop it." The voice came from behind her, deep and firm, and Emma's eyes flew open. She tried to turn, but her body had grown so stiff from the cold that she nearly toppled over. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and then a large figure moved around to face her. The man was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders covered by a heavy coat that was already dusted with snow. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark eyes studying her with intense concern from beneath the brim. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and frost clung to it like decorative lace. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27, weathered by hard living but not yet old. "Madam, what in God's name are you doing out here?" he asked, already shrugging out of his coat. "You will freeze to death in minutes." "That is the idea," Emma heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. The man's eyes widened, and then his jaw set in a determined line. "Well, that is not going to happen today." He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and the warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, made her gasp. "My name is Jacob Quinn, and I am taking you somewhere safe whether you like it or not." "I do not want to be safe," Emma protested, but her words were weak, and her body betrayed her by leaning into the warmth of the coat. "Too bad," Jacob said, and before she could protest further, he had scooped her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "My camp is just over that ridge. You can argue with me all you want once you are warm and have some food in you." Emma wanted to fight him, wanted to demand that he put her down and leave her to the fate she had chosen, but she found she had no strength left for fighting. Her head lolled against his chest, and she could hear the steady thump of his heartbeat through his shirt. It was a living sound, strong and sure, and something about it made tears sting her eyes. "Who are you?" she managed to ask as he carried her through the snow, moving with surprising speed despite her added weight. "Told you already. Jacob Quinn. I am a cattle driver, though I have been doing some bounty work on the side this winter. Was tracking a man who robbed a stage 3 weeks back when I spotted you." He glanced down at her, and she saw something like anger flash in his eyes. "What kind of trouble are you running from?" "The permanent kind," Emma said, and then the world started to spin, and darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. When she woke, she was lying on a bedroll next to a roaring fire, covered with several heavy blankets. The snow was still falling outside, but she was inside some kind of shelter. Looking around, she realized Jacob had made camp in a small cave, just deep enough to provide protection from the elements. His horse, a large buckskin gelding, stood at the entrance, serving as a living windbreak. Jacob himself was crouched by the fire, stirring something in a battered tin pot. He looked up when he heard her stir, and relief washed over his features. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to worry. You were out for near an hour." Emma tried to sit up, and pain shot through her extremities as feeling returned to them. She bit back a cry, and Jacob was at her side immediately, pressing a tin cup into her hands. "Drink this," he ordered. "It is just coffee, but it is hot, and it will help." She took the cup with shaking hands and sipped. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but the heat of it was glorious as it slid down her throat. She drank deeply, feeling warmth spread through her chest and belly. "Thank you," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "You are welcome." He settled back on his heels, studying her. "Now, are you going to tell me your name and what you were doing out there praying for death? Or am I going to have to guess?" Something about his direct manner, so different from the careful politeness most men affected around women, made Emma want to tell him the truth. Or maybe she was just too tired to lie anymore. "My name is Emma Catherine," she said. "And I was praying for death because everyone I love is dead, and the men who killed my father are going to get away with it because they have money and power, and I have nothing." Jacob's expression darkened. "Tell me what happened." So she did. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She told him about her father's refusal to sell to the railroad, about the fire and the gunshot in the night, about the marshal's indifference and her own desperate flight into the wilderness. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face, though she had not realized she was crying. Jacob listened in silence, his jaw growing tighter with each detail. When she finally fell silent, he stood and walked to the cave entrance, staring out at the falling snow with his hands clenched into fists. "Which railroad company?" he asked, his voice hard. "The Rocky Mountain Central," Emma said. "They have been buying up land all through this region, trying to secure a route through to California. My father's ranch sat right where they wanted to lay track." Jacob nodded slowly. "I know them. Bunch of vultures in expensive suits." He turned back to face her. "And you said the lead man came to your ranch personally?" "Yes. His name was Harrison, Charles Harrison. He had cold eyes." Emma shuddered at the memory. "Harrison." Jacob spat the name like a curse. "I know that snake. He has left a trail of bodies across 3 territories, though nobody has ever been able to prove he was behind the killings." He came back to the fire and knelt beside her, his expression fierce. "Emma Catherine, I am going to make you a promise. Those men are not going to get away with what they did, and you are not going to die out here in the snow. Do you understand me?" Emma stared at him, This stranger who had appeared out of a blizzard like an avenging angel and felt something stir in her chest that she thought had died with her father. It was not hope, not quite, but it was something close to it. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." Jacob's expression softened, and he reached out to brush a strand of damp hair back from her face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Maybe I do not know you yet," he said, "but I know you do not deserve what happened to you. And I know that any woman brave enough to walk into a blizzard and face down death itself is worth saving." Emma felt fresh tears well up, but these were different somehow. "I do not feel brave. I feel broken." "Broken things can be mended," Jacob said firmly. "Now you need to eat something. I have some stew here. Nothing fancy, but it will put strength back in you." He ladled thick stew into a bowl and handed it to her. Emma ate mechanically at first, but as the food hit her empty stomach, hunger roared to life, and she found herself eating ravenously. Jacob watched with satisfaction, refilling her bowl twice before she finally felt full. "Better?" he asked. "Better," she admitted. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn." "Just Jacob," he said. "We are past formalities, I think, given that I found you half frozen and praying for death." Despite everything, Emma felt her lips twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Very well, Jacob, and you may call me Emma. Emma." He said her name like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth. "It suits you." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside the cave. Emma found herself studying Jacob in the firelight. He had a strong face, all hard planes and angles, but there was kindness in his eyes. His hands, when she looked at them, were scarred and calloused from hard work, but they had been gentle when they touched her. "Where were you planning to go?" Jacob asked eventually. "Before you decided to give up, I mean." Emma shook her head. "I had no plan, I just ran. I thought maybe I could reach Salt Lake City, find work there, but I do not know anyone there, and I have no references, no money." She laughed bitterly. "I suppose I was always going to end up dying in the snow. I just hastened the process." "You are not going to die," Jacob said again, his voice brooking no argument. "And you are not alone anymore, Emma. I am going to help you." "Why?" Emma asked again. "I still do not understand why you would involve yourself in this. If you go after Harrison and the railroad, you will be putting yourself in danger." Jacob's eyes glinted in the firelight. "I told you I do bounty work. I am used to danger. And as for why," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Let me tell you something. 5 years ago I had a sister. Her name was Margaret, and she was the sweetest person you could ever hope to meet. She married a man who turned out to be a monster. He beat her, hurt her in ways I cannot bring myself to say aloud. She ran from him, tried to get help, but nobody would listen. Women were supposed to obey their husbands, no matter what everyone said." His voice had gone rough with emotion, and Emma saw pain flash across his face. "One night, he beat her so badly that she never woke up. By the time I found out and got there, she was already dead. The law did nothing. Said it was a domestic matter, between husband and wife. That son of a demon is still walking around free somewhere, probably with a new wife to torment." "I am so sorry," Emma whispered, her heart aching for him. "I swore that day that I would never stand by and let someone suffer if I had the power to stop it," Jacob continued. "So when I see a woman in trouble, a woman who has been wronged by men with power who think they can do whatever they want without consequences, I do not walk away. I cannot. My sister would haunt me if I did." Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks again. "Your sister was lucky to have a brother who loved her so much." "Not lucky enough," Jacob said grimly. "I was too late to save her, but I am not too late to save you, Emma. And I am not too late to make sure the men who killed your father face justice." "How?" Emma asked. "How can we possibly fight the railroad? They have unlimited money and men with guns. We start by surviving this storm, Jacob said. Then we go back to Taylorsville and we gather evidence. We find witnesses. We make enough noise that the railroad cannot sweep this under the rug, and if the law will not help us, then we take our case to the newspapers, to the territorial governor, to anyone who will listen. That could take months, Emma said. And we would need money for travel for lawyers. I have money, Jacob interrupted. Not a fortune, but enough. I have been saving up, planning to buy some land and settle down eventually. I can use that money for this instead. Land can wait. Justice cannot. Emma stared at him, overwhelmed. You would do that for me? Spend your savings on a stranger? You are not a stranger anymore, Jacob said simply. And yes, I would. I will. So stop arguing and let me help you. Emma did not know what to say. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from wanting to die to being offered a lifeline by a man who had no reason to care about her fate. It felt surreal, like something out of a penny dreadful novel. I do not know how I can ever repay you, she said finally. Do not die in the snow, Jacob said. That is payment enough. Now you should rest. The storm sounds like it is settling in for the night, so we are not going anywhere until morning at the earliest. He was right. Emma could hear the wind screaming outside, and when she looked toward the cave entrance, she could see snow falling so thickly that the horse was barely visible. Jacob spread out another bedroll for himself on the opposite side of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. Jacob, Emma said as he settled down. Yes, thank you for everything, for saving my life, for caring. He looked at her across the flames, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You are worth saving, Emma Catherine. I hope you will come to see that yourself. Emma pulled the blankets up around her shoulders and closed her eyes, but sleep was long in coming. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, kept circling back to the moment when Jacob had appeared behind her in the snow. It felt like divine intervention, like God had sent her an angel after all, just not in the form she had expected. And there was something else, something she was almost afraid to acknowledge. When Jacob had touched her face, when he had said her name, she had felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold or fear or grief. It was attraction, pure and simple, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had never had time for courting or romance. Her life had been consumed with helping her father run the ranch, with caring for her dying brother, with simply surviving from one day to the next. She had assumed she would be an old maid, had made peace with that idea. But now, lying in a cave with a blizzard raging outside and a handsome stranger sleeping 6 feet away, she found herself wondering what it might be like to be courted by a man like Jacob Quinn. Foolish, she told herself firmly. The man is helping you out of kindness and a sense of justice, nothing more. Do not mistake compassion for romantic interest. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was of Jacob's eyes in the firelight and the way he had said she was worth saving. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Emma and Jacob lived in close quarters in the cave, and Emma found herself learning more about the man who had saved her life. Jacob, it turned out, had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had drunk himself to death after losing everything in a drought. He and his sister Margaret had been sent to live with an uncle who worked them like pack animals and beat them when they were too slow or made mistakes. I left as soon as I was old enough to work a real job, Jacob told her on the second day, as they sat by the fire eating jerky and hardtack. I was 14, and I swore I would come back for Margaret as soon as I had enough money saved to take care of both of us. But by the time I did, she was already married to that monster, and she kept insisting everything was fine, that I should not worry about her. She was probably ashamed, Emma said softly. Women are taught to hide that kind of thing, to pretend everything is perfect. I know that now, Jacob said. But back then, I was young and stupid, and I believed her when she smiled and told me she was happy. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. Emma reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of comfort. You cannot blame yourself. You were trying to respect her wishes. Jacob turned his hand over and clasped hers, his grip warm and strong. Maybe, but I can make sure that other women do not suffer the same fate if I have the power to prevent it, starting with you. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the fire crackling between them. Emma was acutely aware of every point where his skin touched hers, of the calluses on his palm and the steady strength in his fingers. When he finally released her hand, she felt oddly bereft. As the hours passed, they talked about everything and nothing. Emma told him about her childhood, about the joy of growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about the way her mother used to sing while she cooked. Jacob told her about his years as a cattle driver, about the endless miles of trail and the camaraderie of the other cowboys, about sleeping under the stars and feeling like he could ride forever. You miss it? Emma asked. The cattle drives. Sometimes, Jacob admitted. There was a freedom to that life that I have not found anywhere else. But it was also lonely, always moving, never putting down roots. I am ready for something more permanent now, a place to call home, maybe a family someday. You would make a good father, Emma said without thinking, and then blushed furiously when Jacob looked at her with raised eyebrows. I just mean, you are kind and patient and you care about doing the right thing. Those are good qualities in a father. Thank you, Jacob said, and there was something in his voice that made Emma's blush deepen. I think you would make a wonderful mother yourself. I can tell you are strong and brave, even if you do not see it in yourself yet. They fell into a charged silence, and Emma found herself wishing she had the courage to say what she was thinking, to acknowledge the attraction that seemed to be growing between them with every passing hour. But fear held her tongue. What if she was wrong? What if Jacob was just being kind, and she was misinterpreting his gestures as romantic interest? On the third day, the storm finally broke. They woke to pale sunlight streaming through the cave entrance, and a world transformed into a pristine white landscape. Jacob immediately began packing up their camp, moving with efficient purpose. We need to get you somewhere warm and safe, he said, and then we need to start planning our next move. Where will we go? Emma asked. I cannot go back to Taylorsville. If the railroad men find out I survived, they might come after me. We will go to Ogden, Jacob decided. It is a bigger town, easier to disappear in. I have some contacts there who can help us, people I trust. We can figure out our strategy and gather what we need before we make any moves against the railroad. They broke camp and set out on Jacob's horse, Emma riding in front of him with his arms around her as he held the reins. The closeness should have been improper, scandalous even, but Emma found she did not care. She felt safe in the circle of his arms, safer than she had felt since before her father died. The journey to Ogden took 2 days of hard riding. They stopped at a small town called Farmington to rest and resupply, and Jacob insisted on buying Emma some warmer clothes and a proper coat. She protested about the expense, but he waved off her concerns. You cannot help me get justice for your father if you freeze to death, he said firmly. Now stop arguing and let me take care of you. It was a novel experience being taken care of. Emma had been the caretaker for so long, first for her mother during her final pregnancy, then for her dying brother, and finally for her father after Thomas passed. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone else take charge, to have someone else worry about her needs and comfort. They reached Ogden on a crisp January evening. the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun set behind the Wasatch Mountains. Jacob led them to a respectable boarding house run by a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Porter, who softened visibly when Jacob explained that Emma was his widowed cousin who had fallen on hard times and needed a place to stay. "Of course, Mr. Quinn," Mrs. Porter said, her eyes full of sympathy as she looked at Emma. "I have a lovely room on the second floor that will do nicely, and do not you worry about payment right away, dear. We can work something out." Emma marveled at how easily the lie had come to Jacob, how smoothly he had created a respectable story that would protect her reputation. She went along with it, playing the grieving widow, and Mrs. Porter showed her to a small but clean room with a real bed and a wash basin. "I will be staying at the hotel down the street," Jacob told her once Mrs. Porter had left them alone. "I will come by tomorrow morning and we can start making plans. In the meantime, you rest and recover. You have been through hell, Emma. Give yourself permission to heal." "Will you really come back?" Emma asked, hating the fear in her voice. "You are not just going to disappear now that I am safe." Jacob took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. "I swear on my sister's grave that I will be here tomorrow morning. I am not leaving you, Emma. I told you we are going to see this through together." And then, before she could second-guess herself, Emma rose up on her toes and kissed his cheek. It was a brief, chaste gesture, but she felt Jacob stiffen in surprise. When she pulled back, his eyes had darkened, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jacob raised one hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite gentleness. "Sleep well, Emma Catherine. I will see you in the morning." After he left, Emma sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, touching her fingers to her lips and wondering what was happening to her. She was falling for Jacob Quinn, she realized. Despite everything, despite her grief and fear and uncertainty about the future, she was falling in love with the man who had saved her from the snow. True to his word, Jacob appeared at the boarding house the next morning, carrying a basket of fresh pastries and looking well-rested. Emma had spent the night in actual comfort for the first time in days, washing properly and sleeping in a real bed, and she felt almost human again. They sat in the boarding house parlor, which was empty at this hour, and Jacob spread a map out on the table between them. "I spent last night thinking about our situation," he said. "And I believe our best course of action is to gather evidence and build a case that is so strong the railroad cannot ignore it. We need witnesses who saw Harrison or his men around your ranch. We need documentation of the threats your father received. We need to establish a pattern of the railroad using intimidation and violence to get what they want." "That is going to be difficult," Emma said. "Most people in Taylorsville are too frightened of the railroad to talk. And the ones who are not frightened are in the railroad's pocket. Which is why we do not start in Taylorsville," Jacob said. "I have been thinking about what you told me, about Harrison leaving a trail of bodies. If that is true, then your father is not the only person he has killed or had killed. There must be other victims, other families who want justice. If we can find them and get them to come forward together, we create a case too big to sweep under the rug." Emma felt a flicker of hope. That could work, but how do we find these other families? "We start by talking to people who would know," Jacob said. "Newspaper editors, lawmen in other towns, maybe even railroad employees who have a conscience. It will take time and legwork, but I think we can do it." Over the next several weeks, that was exactly what they did. Jacob proved to be a skilled investigator, charming information out of reluctant sources and connecting dots that Emma would never have seen. They traveled to small towns throughout northern Utah and southern Idaho, tracking down leads and gathering stories. In a town called Brigham City, they found a widow whose husband had refused to sell his farm to the railroad and had died in a suspicious fire 3 months before Emma's father. In Malad, Idaho, they met a rancher who had been beaten within an inch of his life by men he swore worked for Harrison, though he could not prove it. In Logan, a newspaper editor showed them letters he had received from concerned citizens about the railroad's strong-arm tactics, letters he had been too afraid to publish. With each story they gathered, Emma felt her sense of purpose growing stronger. This was bigger than just her own grief and loss. This was about standing up for all the people who had been victimized by the railroad's greed and violence. And working alongside Jacob, she found herself falling deeper in love with him every day. He was tireless in his pursuit of justice, but he was also unfailingly gentle with her, always making sure she was comfortable and cared for. When they had to travel long distances, he would insist on stopping frequently so she could rest. When she grew discouraged, he would find ways to make her laugh, telling stories about his cattle driving days or making wry observations about the people they met. And in the evenings, when they would review what they had learned that day, Emma would catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. But Jacob never made any inappropriate advances. He was always the perfect gentleman, maintaining proper distance even as the tension between them grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma found herself wishing he would be a little less proper, a little more forward, but she lacked the courage to make the first move herself. It was in early March, nearly 2 months after Jacob had found Emma in the snow, that things finally came to a head. They were staying in a hotel in Kareen, a rough railroad town where they had gone to interview former railroad workers. Emma had just finished getting ready for bed when there was a sharp knock on her door. She opened it to find Jacob standing there, his face grim. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately, pulling her robe tighter around herself. "I just spoke with a man who used to work for the Rocky Mountain Central," Jacob said. "He quit 3 weeks ago because he could not stomach what they were doing anymore. Emma, he has proof. He has documents showing that Harrison personally ordered the intimidation campaigns. He has names, dates, specific incidents. This is exactly what we need to take to the authorities." Emma's heart leaped. "That is wonderful. Can we trust him? Will he testify?" "He says he will if we can guarantee his protection," Jacob said. "And I believe him. He is genuinely disgusted by what he saw." He stepped into her room, closing the door behind him, and Emma was suddenly very aware that she was in her nightclothes, and they were alone in her hotel room in the middle of the night. "This is it, Emma," Jacob continued, his voice intense. "We have enough now. We can go to the territorial governor, maybe even contact federal marshals. The railroad is going to pay for what they did to your father and all those other people." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than grief. "We actually did it," she whispered. "I cannot believe we actually did it." "We made a good team," Jacob said, and there was something in his voice that made Emma look up at him sharply. They stood there, facing each other in the lamplight, and the air between them crackled with unspoken words and suppressed desire. Emma saw the exact moment when Jacob's careful control began to crack. His eyes dropped to her lips and his breathing grew ragged. "Emma," he said, his voice rough. "I need to tell you something." "What?" she whispered, her heart pounding. "These past 2 months working with you, getting to know you, I have been falling in love with you," Jacob said in a rush. "I know the timing is terrible, and I know you have been through hell, and the last thing you probably need is me complicating things with my feelings. But I cannot keep pretending anymore. I love you, Emma Catherine. I think I started loving you that day in the snow when you were brave enough to look death in the eye and not flinch, and every day since then, I have just fallen harder." Emma felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "Jacob," she breathed. "I am not asking you for anything," he continued quickly. "I know you might not feel the same way, and that is all right. I just needed you to know, before this is all over and we go our separate ways, that you have completely captured my heart. Go our separate ways." Emma repeated, focusing on those words. "Why would we go our separate ways?" Jacob looked confused. "Well, once we bring down Harrison and the railroad, once justice is served, you will be free to start a new life wherever you want. I assumed you would want to do that without me hovering around." "You are an idiot," Emma said, and then she closed the distance between them and kissed him. For a heartbeat, Jacob stood frozen in shock. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he was kissing her back with a passion that stole her breath. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Emma had occasionally received from would-be suitors in her youth. This was fierce and hungry, filled with 2 months of suppressed desire and emotion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emma kept her hands fisted in Jacob's shirt, afraid that if she let go he might disappear. "I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out. "I have been in love with you for weeks, but I was too afraid to say anything. I thought you were just being kind, that you saw me as a charity case or a sister figure or something." Jacob laughed, a sound of pure joy. "A sister figure." "Emma, I have been torturing myself every night, lying awake thinking about you, wanting you, forcing myself to be a gentleman when all I wanted to do was kiss you senseless." "Then kiss me senseless now," Emma said, surprising herself with her boldness. Jacob needed no further invitation. He kissed her again, and somewhere in the haze of desire, they ended up on the edge of her bed, wrapped in each other's arms. But when his hands started to stray, when things started to move toward a point of no return, Jacob pulled back with a groan. "We should not," he said, his voice strained. "Not until we are married. I will not compromise you like that, Emma." "Then marry me," Emma said recklessly. "Right now, tonight. There must be a minister or justice of the peace somewhere in this town who can perform the ceremony." Jacob stared at her. "You want to get married tonight? Why not?" Emma asked. "We love each other. We have been through more together in 2 months than most couples experience in a lifetime, and honestly, Jacob, I do not want to wait. I have spent too much of my life waiting for things that never came. I want to seize happiness while I have the chance." A slow smile spread across Jacob's face. "You are serious." "Completely serious," Emma confirmed. "Unless you do not want to marry me, in which case I am going to be mortified," and he silenced her with another kiss. "I want to marry you more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. Let me go find someone who can make this official." An hour later, they stood in the parlor of a Methodist minister, who Jacob had roused from sleep with a generous payment and a promise of more if he would perform a wedding ceremony immediately. The minister's wife served as a witness, looking scandalized but also charmed by the obvious love between the couple. The ceremony was simple and quick, but when Jacob slipped a plain gold band onto Emma's finger, a ring he had purchased from the minister's wife for what was probably an exorbitant price, Emma felt like her heart would burst with happiness. And when the minister pronounced them man and wife, when Jacob kissed her in front of God and witnesses, she knew that this was right, that this was meant to be. They returned to Emma's hotel room as husband and wife, and what happened there was private and sacred, and more beautiful than Emma could have imagined. Jacob was gentle and patient, guiding her through her first experience with love, and when they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, Emma felt whole for the first time since her father's death. "I love you, Mrs. Quinn," Jacob murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Quinn," Emma replied, and then she giggled, giddy with happiness and the strangeness of it all. I cannot believe we got married tonight. People are going to think we are insane. Let them think what they want, Jacob said. I have you, and that is all that matters. The next morning, they set out to finish what they had started. Armed with the evidence they had gathered and the testimony of multiple witnesses, they traveled to Salt Lake City and presented their case to the territorial governor. The governor, a stern man named Emery who had built his reputation on fighting corruption, listened intently to everything they had to say. "This is quite the investigation you have conducted," he said when they finished. "And if even half of what you are telling me is true, then the Rocky Mountain Central Railroad has been operating as a criminal enterprise." "It is all true," Jacob said firmly, "and we have the evidence to prove it." Governor Emery studied them both for a long moment. "I am going to be honest with you. Taking on the railroad is not going to be easy. They have powerful friends in Washington, but they do not own me, and they do not own the federal marshals. Give me your evidence, and I will make sure it gets into the right hands." Over the next several months, the case against Charles Harrison and the Rocky Mountain Central Railroad grew. Federal marshals arrested Harrison on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted extortion. Other railroad executives were implicated as the investigation widened. The newspaper stories that resulted created a scandal that rocked the entire territory. Through it all, Emma and Jacob stood together, testifying when needed, supporting the other victims who came forward, refusing to be intimidated by the veiled threats that still occasionally came their way. And slowly, painfully, justice was served. Harrison was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The railroad was forced to pay massive fines and restitution to the families of victims. The corrupt marshal in Taylorsville was removed from office. It was not perfect justice. Nothing could bring back Emma's father or the other people who had died. But it was something, and it meant that their deaths had not been in vain. Through all of this, Emma's love for Jacob only deepened. He was her rock, her partner, her best friend. And as spring turned to summer and then to fall, she began to suspect that their love had created something new. The doctor confirmed it in October. She was pregnant, due to give birth sometime in late April or early May. When she told Jacob the news, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy, before carefully setting her down and asking anxiously if spinning her had been bad for the baby. Emma laughed and kissed him. "The baby is fine. We are all fine. Better than fine." They decided to leave Utah, to start fresh somewhere new where they were not known as the couple who brought down the railroad. Jacob had been corresponding with a rancher in Montana who was looking for a partner to help expand his operation. It seemed like a good opportunity, a chance to build something lasting. They spent the winter in a small house in Ogden, preparing for the baby and making plans for their future. Emma had never been happier. Sometimes she would wake in the night and reach for Jacob, needing to reassure herself that he was real, that this life they were building together was not just a dream. "I am here," he would murmur, pulling her close. "I am always going to be here, Emma. I promise you that." In late April, on a day when the trees were just starting to bud, and the air smelled of rain and new growth, Emma went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was sure she could not go on. But Jacob stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling with indignation, Emma burst into tears of joy and relief. Jacob cut the cord with shaking hands, and when the midwife placed the baby in Emma's arms, she looked up at her husband and saw tears streaming down his face too. "He is perfect," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. absolutely perfect, just like his mother. They named him Thomas Jacob Quinn after Emma's lost brother and his father. Thomas, they called him Tommy, and he had Emma's dark hair and Jacob's strong features. Emma had worried during her pregnancy that she might feel bitter, that having her own child might make her think too much about the family she had lost. But holding Tommy, looking at Jacob's adoring face, she felt only gratitude for the family she had found. They moved to Montana when Tommy was 3 months old, settling on a ranch in the Bitterroot Valley that took Emma's breath away with its beauty. The work was hard, but it was good work, building something with their own hands. Jacob proved to be an excellent rancher, and Emma discovered that she had a talent for managing the business side of things, keeping the books and negotiating sales. Their first year in Montana was full of challenges. They faced a hard winter, lost some cattle to wolves, and struggled to establish themselves in a community where they were outsiders. But they faced it all together, and somehow that made even the hardest times bearable. More children came as the years passed. A daughter they named Margaret Grace, after Jacob's sister and as a nod to God's grace that had brought them together, born when Tommy was 2. Then another son, Samuel, 3 years after that. And finally, when Emma was 31 and convinced she was done having babies, a surprise daughter they named Lily Rose. The Quinn Ranch prospered. By the time Tommy was 15, they had one of the largest cattle operations in the valley, employing a dozen hands and running several thousand head of cattle. Jacob had a reputation as a fair but tough boss, and Emma was known for her sharp business sense and generous heart. But for all their success, their greatest achievement was the family they had built. Emma would sometimes stand on the porch of their ranch house, watching Jacob teach Tommy and Samuel how to rope a calf, or seeing Margaret help little Lily feed the chickens, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought often of that day in the snow when she had knelt down and prayed for death. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. That Emma had been broken and hopeless, unable to see any path forward. This Emma was strong and happy, surrounded by love and purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked one evening, coming up behind her on the porch and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Just about how much my life has changed," Emma said, leaning back against him. "Sometimes I still cannot believe how lucky I am." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Jacob said, kissing the top of her head. "We made this life together, Emma, through hard work and faith and love. And because you refused to let me give up that day," Emma reminded him. "You are the one who saved me, Jacob." "We saved each other," Jacob corrected. "I was just as lost as you were, Emma, before I found you. I was drifting, no real purpose or direction. You gave me something to fight for, something to live for." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun set over the mountains. Inside the house, they could hear their children laughing and arguing, the sounds of a family fully alive. It was everything Emma had never dared to hope for and more. As the years continued to pass, the Quinn family became a fixture in the Bitterroot Valley. Tommy grew into a fine young man who eventually took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch. He married a local girl named Sarah, and they gave Emma and Jacob their first grandchildren. Margaret became a teacher, opening a school in town that served all the ranching families in the area. Samuel showed an aptitude for horses and started a breeding program that became famous throughout Montana. And Lily, their baby, surprised everyone by developing a passion for medicine and eventually becoming one of the first female doctors in the territory. Emma and Jacob grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. When Jacob turned 50, Emma threw him a party that brought together their children and grandchildren, and half the valley besides. Looking around at all the people who had come to celebrate her husband, Emma felt her heart swell with pride. This man, this good and decent man who had saved her life all those years ago, had built something lasting and important. "Thank you," she told him that night, after all the guests had gone home and they were alone in the bedroom they had shared for over 25 years. "For what?" Jacob asked, pulling her close. "For not letting me die in that snow," Emma said. "For loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." Jacob cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with the same intensity he had shown that first night in the cave. "Thank you for letting me save you," he said. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose life when it would have been so much easier to choose death. Thank you for loving me back. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Emma Catherine Quinn." They kissed, and it was just as sweet and passionate as their first kiss had been all those years ago in that hotel room in Kareen. Some things, Emma thought, never changed. The love between them had only grown stronger and deeper with time, like a tree with roots that went down into bedrock. When Emma turned 60, they took a trip back to Utah. She had not been back since they left for Montana, and she felt a mixture of trepidation and curiosity as they traveled south. Taylorsville had changed considerably. It was larger now, more prosperous, with new buildings and a railroad station that Jacob noted with dry amusement. They visited the site of her father's ranch. The land had been sold years ago, and there was a different house there now. But Emma could still see echoes of her childhood in the lay of the land, in the shape of the mountains on the horizon. She stood there for a long time, remembering, and then she knelt and said a prayer for her father, her mother, her brother. "They would be proud of you," Jacob said quietly, standing beside her. "Of the life you have built, the woman you have become." "I hope so," Emma said. "I like to think they are watching over us, that they know I found happiness again after losing them." They visited the cemetery where Emma's family was buried. The graves were well maintained, and Emma learned that a trust fund had been established by the governor's office, using some of the restitution money from the railroad case to care for the graves of all the railroad's victims in perpetuity. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. Emma placed flowers on each grave and told her family about their life in Montana, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch they had built. And as she talked, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The grief would always be there, a quiet ache in her heart, but it no longer defined her. She had mourned and she had healed, and she had learned to live again. Their last stop in Utah was in Ogden, where they visited the boarding house where Emma had stayed all those years ago. Mrs. Porter was long dead, but the building was still there, still taking in boarders. Emma stood outside and remembered that scared, broken girl she had been, and marveled at the journey she had taken since then. "I would do it all again," she told Jacob as they prepared to leave Utah and return to Montana. "Every hardship, every moment of fear or pain, I would go through it all again to end up here with you." "I would walk through 1,000 blizzards to find you," Jacob replied. "And I would spend 1,000 lifetimes loving you." They returned to Montana, to their ranch and their family, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of their later years. Jacob's hair went white, and Emma's face gained new lines and wrinkles, but to each other they were always young, always beautiful. They were the couple who had defied death and the railroad, who had built an empire from nothing, who loved each other with a fierce and unwavering devotion. When Jacob was 72, he had a heart attack while out checking on the cattle. Tommy found him and rushed him back to the house, and for 3 days, Emma sat by his bedside, holding his hand and refusing to leave. On the 3rd day, Jacob opened his eyes and smiled at her. "Not yet," he said, his voice weak but determined. "I am not ready to leave you yet." And he did not. The doctor said it was a miracle, but Emma knew it was simply Jacob being Jacob, too stubborn to die when his wife still needed him. He recovered slowly, and though he could no longer do the hard physical labor of ranching, he was still there, still present, still the heart of their family. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a beautiful celebration, filled with music and laughter and love. When Jacob stood to make a toast, his voice was strong and clear. 50 years ago, I married the love of my life in a hastily arranged ceremony in the middle of the night, he said, and everyone laughed. I have never regretted that decision for a single moment. Emma Catherine Quinn, you are my everything. My partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the woman who has made every day of my life worth living. Here is to 50 more years. I will hold you to that, Emma called out, and Jacob grinned and pulled her into a kiss that made their grandchildren shriek with delighted embarrassment. They did not get 50 more years, but they got 10, and those 10 years were full of joy and peace. They spent their days on the porch of the ranch house, watching their descendants work the land they had claimed, telling stories to the great-grandchildren who climbed onto their laps. Jacob died in his sleep on a crisp October morning when he was 82 years old. Emma woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. She did not cry at first. She simply sat there, holding his hand, memorizing every line of his beloved face, thanking God for the gift of 59 years with this extraordinary man. At his funeral, the entire valley turned out to pay their respects. Jacob Quinn had been a pillar of the community, a man everyone respected and many loved. But Emma knew that his greatest legacy was not the ranch or the money or the reputation. It was the family they had created together, the love they had shared, the example they had set. Emma lived for 5 more years after Jacob died. They were lonely years in some ways, but she was never truly alone. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love and care. And she felt Jacob's presence with her always, a warm and comforting ghost that whispered encouragement when she felt sad, that laughed with her when she remembered happy times. On a spring morning very much like the morning Tommy had been born, Emma Catherine Quinn died peacefully in her sleep. She was 87 years old, and she died in the ranch house she and Jacob had built, surrounded by family. Her last words, spoken to Margaret the night before, were about Jacob. "I will see him soon," she had said, smiling. "He is waiting for me, I know it. And this time, instead of finding me in the snow praying for death, he will find me in heaven, and we will have forever." They buried her next to Jacob on a hillside overlooking the ranch. The entire valley came to the funeral, just as they had for Jacob, and stories were told about the Quinns, about their love story, about the day Jacob had found Emma in the snow and refused to let her die. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passing from Tommy to his children and then to their children. And every Quinn child grew up hearing the story of how their family began, of a broken woman who prayed for death in a blizzard, and a determined man who said, "Not while I am here to stop it." It became a legend, a tale of love conquering despair, of two people who saved each other and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And on winter nights, when the snow fell heavy and white over the Bitterroot Valley, some swore they could see 2 figures walking hand in hand through the drifts, a man and a woman who looked young and strong and deeply in love. They said it was the ghosts of Jacob and Emma Quinn, still together even in death, still watching over the family and the land they had loved so much. But perhaps they were not ghosts at all. Perhaps they were something more. A testament to the power of love, to the strength of the human spirit, to the truth that even in our darkest moments, salvation can arrive in the most unexpected forms. Jacob Quinn had found Emma Catherine in the snow, praying for death, and he had given her a reason to live. In return, she had given him everything he had ever wanted: a home, a family, a love that lasted beyond death itself. Their story became part of the fabric of Montana, passed down through generations, inspiring others who faced their own dark nights of the soul. And always, the message was the same. Hold on. Keep fighting. Love is worth it. Life is worth it. No matter how deep the snow or how cold the wind, there is always hope, always the possibility that someone will appear and say the words you need to hear, "Not while I am here to stop it." Those words, spoken by a stranger in a blizzard, had changed everything. They had saved a life, sparked a love story, and created a legacy that would endure for generations. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that Jacob had found Emma, though that had certainly been miraculous, but that they had found each other, two lost souls who had needed exactly what the other had to give. The Quinn Ranch still stands today, more than 130 years after Jacob and Emma first broke ground on that land. The descendants who work it know they are stewards of something sacred, a place built on love and watered with tears and laughter in equal measure. They know the story of their ancestors, and they tell it to their own children, keeping the legend alive. And maybe, just maybe, when the snow falls and the wind howls and someone somewhere is praying for death because the pain is too great to bear, they will remember the story of Emma and Jacob Quinn. They will remember that salvation can come from unexpected places, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes all we need is one person to refuse to let us give up. One person to say, "Not while I am here to stop it." One person to remind us that we are worth saving, worth loving, worth fighting for. That is the legacy of Emma Catherine Quinn and Jacob Quinn, and it lives on still, a light in the darkness, a promise that even in our worst moments we are not alone,